Are you ready to grow your business, build wealth, and spark transformation in the South suburbs of Chicago? Visit southlanddevelopment.org today and sign up for our newsletter to stay connected, get resources, and be the first to hear about the Achieve Summit, where entrepreneurs, developers, investors, and changemakers come together to ignite growth and opportunity. Don't just watch change happen, be a part of it. Join the movement at southlanddevelopment.org and start building your legacy today. In this thought-provoking episode, I will explore a question that every founder must eventually face. Are you building an empire or chasing a payday? This conversation delves deep into the distinction between creating generational wealth through long-term empire building versus scaling and exiting quickly for short-term gain. I challenge listeners to get clear about their purpose and strategic vision, because that clarity is the foundation for understanding if, when, and how much capital your business truly needs. And welcome to our podcast. The first million is always the hardest. I'm the host, Bo Kemp. Pleasure to be with you. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about, are you ready for capital? And what are some of the things that you should be thinking about when it comes to actually taking in capital as an organization? And this really is a conversation that is coupled with a few others, right? So one of the things that you'll see or hear on the podcast is that we talk about the importance of money and how money is relevant to the ability of you as an entrepreneur or an investor to move forward, but it isn't always the most important of all of the components of being successful. It is a component, not the most important. Often people and the ability to execute are as important, if not more important. One of the things we're going to talk about today is this idea of empire building versus creating a business for the purpose of making money, specifically for that purpose, and how the decision to either build an empire versus the decision to actually build a business for sale for the purposes of making money can change a number of the different other strategic decisions that you make as part of the organization. One of the things that is true that many people don't often realize is that one of the largest reasons why companies fail is actually due to growing too fast, not growing enough. When they say 80% of startups fail, a substantial portion of that 80% that fail largely because they've outpaced the funding that they actually have. And so we're going to talk a little bit about something called the sustainable growth equation, an equation that I was spending a lot of time thinking about when I was in business school, and that I use as a vehicle to help me assess where an organization is and how I need to think about its growth strategically. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about clarity around your need for capital, because often your ability to really identify where you need capital and why you need capital is important. Understanding, are you compliance ready? Are you ready to take in capital if that capital were even provided to you? And lastly, connecting the dots between whether it be empire or money making, your clarity of why you need the money, how those things are tied to your goals and your strategy to determine if you're ready for capital. So with that, we'll get started, and we'll go right back to where I had mentioned this idea about the importance of money versus people versus execution. There are going to be other episodes where we talk about the importance of people and execution. Money is obviously an important one, but one of the things that really determines your ability to access money is figuring out exactly what you're trying to accomplish. And one of the questions that you'll hear that I ask in a lot of the interviews that we do as part of this podcast is whether or not the interviewee was focused on creating an empire versus focused on creating a business for sale that would generate wealth right away. Well, when you are focused on building an empire, it tends to follow that you also have to use your own money in order to build that empire because you're not demonstrating a vehicle or a mechanism for a private investor to get their money out quickly. And it also tends to follow, and these are not givens, but are more tendencies that you will build that business from scratch as opposed to buy that business. Whereas when you are building a business that is designed for sale right off the bat, and that's the goal, you're more likely to use other people's money in order to fund the operations, and you're more likely to identify other businesses that can be bought and made part of your larger business because you have access to other people's money. These are not clearly, they're not mutually exclusive. It's not determined that if you do one, you can't do the other. There are many instances where people initially start out with the concept that they're going to build an empire, and then an opportunity comes to sell their business, they decide to sell, or vice versa. They thought they were going to sell their business, and the business is built in such a way that it can facilitate them funding the business, keeping the business within their control. They've decided they want to pass it down to their family. All of those are possibilities. So none of these are clear cut only on one side versus the next. But there is a tendency of how these things follow one another. And it's driven by the idea that if you're using other people's money, you need to clearly show them a way to exit the investment. There needs to be a clear path of, if I've received money from an institution, a friend, whomever it may be, how am I going to pay them back? How are they going to make a return? So they want to see that you actually, are looking to create some methodology that allows you to sell the business and repay them. It could be that you're just going to make so much money in profit that you're going to be paying back from the profits. More often than not, it's that you're going to actually set the business up in some way that someone's going to buy it from you. And in the process of them selling the business, that in turn allows you to pay back your initial investors. Every once in a while, you can be so successful in the development of your business that you can do what they call a recapitalization, meaning that you can actually go maybe borrow money from the bank, buy out your existing investors so that you own more of the company and keep the business, but without some path that you can clearly articulate to outside investors. It's very difficult for outside investors to take the risk to invest in you. Often, in order to get those investors to a place where they can become comfortable that the path that you've described to them that will allow them to be repaid their investment is a legitimate one, it requires you to show that you can scale this business very, very quickly. And that often tends to put you in a place where you're looking to buy additional add-on businesses to the one that you're invested in. And that's part of the reason that you see when people are looking to make money right away, they're looking to figure out how to sell the business. They tend to actually borrow money from other people or get direct investors from an equity perspective, and they tend to look at buying additional businesses to help scale. Those things tend to go together. Well, if you can't articulate to a potential investor how you're going to sell the business, it becomes difficult to raise other people's money. And so when that's the case, typically those businesses have to become empires, right? So when people decide, I want to build this business that I'm going to pass on to my family, I want to maintain equity control in that business, that typically leads them down a path of having to rely on their own funding sources as opposed to other people's money. It's not a guarantee, but it's a tendency that's the case. And because that is the goal of building this empire that they're going to keep control over, and it's hard to raise other people's money, it becomes difficult to identify acquisition targets that you can add on. Not impossible, but much, much more difficult. And as such, people who are trying to build that empire, typically what they're doing is building from scratch something. So they're not able to rely on outside money. They are not able to buy a company, so they're building from scratch. But in exchange for those two situations, they have more control. They can pass that business down. They put themselves in a better position to have the ability to do with the business what they want, i.e., their empire. Um, why do people want to build empires? There's actually lots of reasons why people are focused on empires. Um, Often it's centered around control. Sometimes it's centered around the fear of lack of control, but it's centered around control. Um, Most people who are entrepreneurs don't want to work for someone else because they don't want someone to tell them what to do. And I know I was in that camp for a very long time, and to some degree, I still am in that camp. And the idea of building something that they have control over without not having outside investors who might come in at any given moment and tell them what to do is appealing. And they want to maintain that control. In many instances, and I would say most instances, one of the reasons that people want to build an empire is because they're building a business in their mind that has the capacity to change not only their life, but their family's life, their friends' lives, and in some cases, the community. Sometimes the act of wanting to build an empire isn't at all about greed and it isn't about control, but it's actually about sharing. It's sometimes about the ability to give to family, friends, and community in a way that you can be generous. That's hard to do if you have outside investors who have an expectation that, in fact, you're going to give them a return, right? One of the reasons why many people actually embark on this empire building strategy is because they also don't have access to outside funding. If they could access other people's money and use that for the purposes of driving their business, they might actually consider very differently whether they'd want to go that route or not. But without that access, or at least without them having the perception that they have that access, the easier path is to kind of use sweat equity, um, build that business from scratch, and use both of those as tools to eventually get to a place where you've built an empire that gives you control. The only issue I would have with this is that in many instances, the idea of control is more of an illusion than it is a reality. Even though you may not have a direct investor, outside people's money to invest, you still have other things that are controlling you often, separate from the equity itself. And as we'll learn later in this podcast, there is a direct connection between your ability to raise capital and how quickly you can grow your business. Now, the people that tend to be focused on making money and walk into an opportunity saying, I'm going to build this business for sale, they tend to be faster in terms of building the business. They're faster in terms of getting out of the business. And as a result of that speed, both in scaling and in selling, that means that they have a shorter window where they have to demonstrate to outside money that they're adding value, which in the short means, I can actually generate a higher return on my investment because I'm building up faster and I'm getting out faster. Those are two things that actually become very desirable for outside investors. And the more you can actually convince people that either based on your past, because you've built and sold businesses before, or based on your existing financial model or business model, that you can build this business fast and get out, it becomes easier for you to actually attract other people's money. And in fact, you can sometimes get a lower cost of capital, or meaning the return that's required by those investors could be less than it would be if you hadn't had the previous experience or if your uh, uh, model wasn't as compelling. Um, and so the people who design their business in order to make money are typically on a fast track of figuring out how I increase profitability, increase sales, whether that's through an acquisition or some other type of investment, and get out of that business as quickly as possible. And those things often are tied together in terms of I'm building for money, I'm taking other people's money, I'm making acquisitions, just like empire building is often associated with sweat equity and building from scratch. Now, both are legitimate strategies of how you move forward with your organization, but both can be one or either could be difficult to execute depending on the nature of the industry that you're in. Some industries that require a lot of capital, very capital intensive, as they say, because you've got to buy a lot of equipment or you got to build a big manufacturing site, it becomes very difficult for those businesses to rely on sweat equity. They typically have to go to other people's money in order to raise enough capital to execute their plan. Sometimes, though, um, businesses like a software business that don't necessarily need a lot of money also struggle to build an empire, not because it takes so much money to get them started or keep them going, but because they grow so fast that their need for capital can outpace their existing capacity. And so sometimes the capital intensive nature of the business forces you to choose between empire building and money making, largely because you've got, outside investors have to come to the table in order to fund that. And sometimes the rate of growth of the business requires outside funders, and both can be true. Now, in the case of the software company, as an example, and the outside funders, one of the things I want to talk about is something called the sustainable growth equation. This equation essentially has four components to it that determines what is the sustainable growth rate that your business can actually achieve before one of these four components has to change. And the reason this sustainable growth equation is useful is that it basically says, hey, I can grow at 11% a year, um, given all of these other metrics. But if I want to grow at 12%, I have to change one of these metrics in order to grow at 12%. Otherwise, my business essentially goes bankrupt and I can run out of cash and be insolvent right away. I have used this equation as a vehicle to help me quickly assess the nature of a business or an investment opportunity, um, by highlighting the areas that I either have the greatest capacity to make a change or demonstrating that I'm restricted from making changes in certain areas. Therefore, I can only focus on this one component. Now, I'm going to walk through what the components are of the sustainable growth equation so you can see how it can be leveraged as a tool to potentially help you either do some due diligence on a company, make an assessment on a potential investment, and think strategically about what you do going forward. So there is the simple way of thinking about this is that your return on equity um, minus or multiplied by your what they call your dividend ratio determines exactly the percentage of growth you can have on year revenue before you have to make a change. A better way of saying this, or maybe a simpler way, is there's profitability that ties into this. So, how profitable is your product? The greater profitability of your product, the faster you're able to grow. There's also another component that profitability feeds into, which is your return on assets. And that means how much return do you make on the investable assets? So, in the instance that you've got a company that uses a lot of assets, meaning the equipment is very expensive, you have to build a big business. For um, every if the same level of profitability, you have a lesser return on assets because you use a lot of assets to build that business. But let's say you're a software company, which doesn't take a lot of money to build the software. For every dollar you make in that business, you can actually grow at a faster pace, right? So, to all else equal, if I were to produce a steel company, right, my return on my assets would be less for every dollar than if I were to have a software company. My return on my assets there would be higher. So I should expect, all else equal, that I can actually grow faster as a software company than I can grow a steel company, because otherwise I have to make some change in the equation. In addition to profitability, which feeds into your return on assets, there's also what they call leverage. And in this case, a way to think about leverage is it's debt and equity. But another way of thinking about it is your total assets over your average equity. And what that's really telling you is that in order for me to fund the assets that are required to build this business, I either have to raise debt or I have to raise equity to invest in this business. And let's just take the steel plant and the software company as an example again. Given that the steel plant is capital intensive, meaning that there's a lot of assets you have to invest, typically that's a plant that, because they're big machines that you have to buy and they're very expensive, I can go to a bank and borrow against some of those. So one of the ways that a large capital intensive business like steel is able to fund its growth is by borrowing money against its plant, borrowing money against its equipment, in some cases, borrowing money against its product itself. Whereas for a software company, it's much more difficult for them to actually go and get a loan because there's not a lot of assets in the development of the software itself. So there's not much collateral, something that the bank could use as a backstop in the event that you don't repay the loan. So in the case of a software company, typically you have to rely completely on equity. Equity is a form of investment where they take the same risk that you would take as an operator. If you make money, the investors that are equity investors make money. If you don't make any money, they don't make any money either. Whereas on the debt side, if a bank gives me money against, let's say, the plant equipment in a steel company, if all goes kaput, the bank could actually take at least the manufacturing equipment and resell it to get repaid, at least in part, their loan, right? So a software company typically is not a highly leveraged company. Typically, they rely on equity. A large capital intensive business, whether it be real estate or be a manufacturing business, they typically do rely on leverage or debt as a form of funding their financial needs. So there are three components, again, that go into um, the, the sustainable equation that I've described so far. There's profitability, how profitable the business. The more profitable your product is, the faster you can grow. There's return on assets, right? So the faster you have return on assets, the faster you can grow. There's leverage, which means the more debt or leverage that you can take on that business, typically the faster you can grow. And those three components together actually help you calculate what's called return on equity. And that's how much money I get back on equity. The last component of the sustainable growth equation is the dividend payout. And usually really fast growing businesses like a software company, they don't pay out any dividends. All of the return that you get is based on a return on equity. And so typically when you are calculating return on equity, that's in effect the same as the return, the calculation for sustainable growth. But there are large businesses, particularly capital intensive businesses, whether it be a steel company or a utility business that have a lot of assets and can borrow a lot of money. They often will provide a dividend, right? So utility companies are often one of the types of companies that if you buy their stock, they also give you a dividend. And that's a regular, usually quarterly, sometimes monthly, sometimes annual payment that comes from owning the stock in that business that goes to you as a payment. That's them taking a portion of their return on equity and handing it to you in cash as an investor to encourage you to actually make the equity investment in that business. Capital intensive businesses are the ones that are most likely be in a position to provide you a dividend because they can leverage their building, they can leverage sometimes their product, they can leverage their manufacturing componentry in order to borrow money. Those are the components of the sustainable growth equation. And the reason I go through that process is if you start to think theoretic or systematically about your business, you can figure out whether you can grow at 11% versus 12% versus 10% versus 50%. And if you can't achieve the growth that you are anticipating based on your current structure, you can start to pinpoint where you have to make the change. Oh, I may have to make my product 10% more profitable in order to grow by an extra 2%. Oh, I may need to figure out how to increase my return on assets by 10% in order to increase my growth possibility by 3%. Oh, I may need to borrow more money to leverage the business so that I can boost my leverage and in turn boost my return on equity in order to grow faster. And this is really a mechanism to really help people think through strategically what the needs of their business is. Why does all of that matter? And what is it that we're trying to get at? Many companies die, as I mentioned before, because they grow too fast. And what they miss in this process is that one of those components or more of those components of the sustainable growth equation are a key to their success or failure. And if they want to grow at an even faster clip, they're going to need to change profitability. They either need to change the return on assets or they need to change the leverage in order to affect the return on equity. And if you don't do these things, you put yourself in jeopardy. There are many, many stories that you're going to hear about. And I've lived some myself where we had a business that was doing $25-30 million a year in revenue, was profitable. But because we were not monitoring, our return on assets and therefore our return on equity, we had a cash flow gap of about $3 million, where we needed $3 million, but we needed it in a specific time frame in order to stay afloat. And by missing that time frame and not raising the $3 million, even though we made $30 million as an organization every year, it could force you into a place where you have to sell assets or you go bankrupt. And this happens to a lot of different businesses. And so understanding that sustainable growth rate is a core component to figuring out when and how and if you are in fact ready for capital. Now, there are other elements around this as well. One is the clarity of what you need the capital for. So I gave you the example of the steel company and the software company. In the case of a steel company, if what you were showing to the outside world, whether it be a bank to borrow money or equity investors, that the money that you're about to raise is going to somehow increase the profitability of a steel manufacturing plant, that clarity and being able to walk someone through that process goes a long way in your ability to actually attract the capital that you might need. Your inability to describe precisely how you're going to use that money and for what purpose and how that will actually ripple through the return on equity benefits to a potential investor could prevent you from being in a position to borrow the money. Likewise, many of the organizations, particularly small businesses and medium businesses that we work with, they're not compliance ready. They haven't actually done the work, whether it is filing their IRS tax forms. They haven't done the work in terms of doing their audit forms from an accounting perspective. They may not have been compliant with a variety of other city, state, or federal registrations and certifications. And all of those things can compromise your ability, in fact, to be ready to take on capital. But it really boils down to you having a clear, precise understanding of what your goal is. If I am selling a business, if I'm building a business rather to sell, right, I'm more likely to take other people's money. And as a result of that, it becomes really important for me to understand how the sustainable growth equation might play into the strategic structure of the business and how I pitch this to an investor. If I'm looking to build an empire, the sustainable growth equation still applies to me, because if my empire is growing at a faster clip than what I can finance myself, I'll have no choice but to go to other people's money. And the moment that I start with an empire that I now have to go and borrow money or I have to get new investors, it changes the nature of your capacity to build an empire. It doesn't preclude you from doing so, but it changes that nature because now I have another investor who has a different interest than I may have if I'm trying to build an empire. They may have a stronger interest in getting out of the investment and getting a return on their money. This is some of the way that we like to frame the issue around how you get yourself ready for capital and whether you are ready for capital. But this is one of the important components that when you hear the variety of interviews that we'll do in this podcast in this season and future seasons will come up over and over and over again. So just want to thank you for your time.